So there's a reason this day in Holy Week is called Spy Wednesday. Because on this day, while Jesus is teaching in the temple courts, while the crowds are still listening, while the disciples are still following, one of them slips away quietly in secret to make a deal. Judas Iscariot goes to the chief priests and he asks them a question. It's one of those chilling lines in the entire gospel story. What are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you? Story tells us it was 30 pieces of silver. From that moment on, he's looking for the right opportunity. Now, I know what you're expecting me to do with Judas. I grew up in church too. I know this arc. Judas is the villain. Judas is the cautionary tale. Judas is the one bad animal. You'll be like Judas. And I want to do something different today. Because I think Judas is one of the most important and most misread figures in this entire story. And I think that if we actually honestly look at, we're going to see something uncomfortable. Something that looks a lot less like a cartoon villain and a lot more like Oliver. I'm your host, Reverend Andrew Graham Shipley. This is another episode of the Missiongathering Christian Church Disciples of Christ podcast, and we are still in our series, Unlearning Empire. Today's episode is The Deal in the Dark. Let's get into it. Let's start by recovering something the tradition has mostly buried. So Judas wasn't an outsider. He wasn't a plant. He wasn't an op. It wasn't some sort of like Roman con intel pro. He was not someone who was obviously bad from the beginning while everyone else was obviously good. He was one of the 12, one of the 12 chosen, one of the 12 trusted, one of the 12 close to Jesus. He traveled with Jesus for 3 years. He saw healings. He heard teachings. He was present for the feeding of the 5,000, the transfiguration, and the raising of Lazarus. He was, by any reasonable measure, an insider. And he was so trusted, he was the one that carried the money. It means the community trusted him with something practical and something important. You don't give the finances to someone you don't trust if you're smart. So whatever happened with Judas, it didn't happen because he was obviously unworthy from the start. It happened inside a relationship, inside a community, inside proximity to something genuinely good. And I don't know about you, but that's so much more interesting to me and so much more uncomfortable than the cartoon villain version. You say, but okay, Pastor Andrew, now why did he do it? Well, the gospel gives us different angles for each one, right? Gospel of John says the devil entered him. Luke says something similar. Matthew focuses on the 30 pieces of silver, suggesting greed. But there's another tradition that's not in the canon, but in early Christian writings, that suggests Judas was a zealot, someone who believed deeply in the liberation of Israel from Roman occupation. someone who would follow Jesus because he believed Jesus was going to lead a revolution. And by Wednesday, after Jesus' triumphal entry that didn't trigger an uprising, after the temple disruption that didn't spark a rebellion, after days of teaching that were brilliant but not military, maybe Judas had decided that Jesus wasn't going to do what needed to be done. And maybe, in his own broken logic, he thought that forcing confrontation would finally make Jesus act in the way he thought Jesus should act. Maybe Judas even thought he was helping. I'm not saying that to excuse him, right? We own our actions and our decisions. I'm saying that because I think that the most dangerous betrayals are rarely the ones that feel like betrayal from the inside. They're the ones that feel like strategy, like pragmatism, like doing what has to be done when the person you believed isn't moving fast enough. Here's the thing about the chief priests going to Judas. And actually, let me back up. Matthew tells us that Judas went to the chief priests first. He initiated the conversation. But Luke tells us the chief priests had been looking for a way to get rid of Jesus for days. That the opportunity came when Judas showed up. Both things can be true because that's how this works, right? Systems that need complicity don't usually recruit you with a full pitch up front. They create conditions, they watch for pressure points, they wait for moments when someone is frustrated enough, delusioned enough, and desperate enough. And then they make it very easy to take the step that was already forming in the shadows. The chief priest didn't have to talk Judas into anything. He didn't have to really talk to Judas much at all. They just had to be available when he arrived at the conclusion that he'd been moving towards for a while, right? Like he'd already been thinking about these things. And they paid him, which made it a transaction, which made it feel more normal, which made it easier to live with. And friend, if you listen, I want to name something directly here. This is how institutional corruption always works. It almost never announces itself. Nobody walks into a room and says, we'd like you to help us harm people. Here's your payment, sign here. Present administration excluded, right? It's slower than that. It's quieter than that. It's a series of small accommodations, small silences, small decisions to look the other way. It's learning which conversations are safe and which ones will cost you your position. It's figuring out which people you can advocate for and which ones will make the institution uncomfortable. It's deciding maybe just this once to protect the institution instead of protecting the person the institution harmed. And each small step feels reasonable in the moment. Each one has a justification. Each one comes with its version of, this is just how things work. I'm being pragmatic. I'm staying at the table so I can do more good later. And then one day you look up and you're somewhere you never intended to be. The philosopher Hannah Arendt called this the banality of evil. Not cartoonish villainy, not dramatic betrayal, just ordinary people making ordinary compromises inside ordinary institutions until the accumulation of those compromises becomes something monstrous. Judas didn't become the betrayer on Wednesday. Wednesday is just when the deal got signed. Let's talk about something I think that's very specific to where a lot of us are right now. We're in a moment that has watched institutions fail in real time. Not abstract institutional failure, specific, named, documented failure. We watched churches protect abusers and exile people who reported them. We watched Christian universities issue statements about the sanctity of every human life and then quietly settle lawsuits filed by their students whose lives they didn't protect. We watched denominations spend decades debating whether LGBTQ people are fully human while those same people sat in the pews, gave their tithes, served in the nursery, and waited to find out if they would still be able to belong. We watched Christian leaders who built entire platforms on justice language make backroom deals to protect their own relevance the moment justice work got expensive. We recognized something in that, didn't we? We recognized the chief priests. We recognized the 30 pieces of silver. We recognized the deal made in the dark by people who knew better and chose otherwise. And a lot of us left, or we're in the process of leaving, or you left and came back to something smaller and more honest, and we're still watching carefully to see if it holds. And I want to say something to that, right? I want to tell you something right now, a truth for you. Your instinct to watch carefully is right. Not because every institution is corrupt, not because trust is impossible, but because trust without accountability is just another word for naivety. And you've earned your caution. Listen to it. That being said, here's what I think Spy Wednesday is actually teaching us about institutions and loyalty. Loyalty to an institution is not the same thing as loyalty to what the institution claims to represent. The chief priests were deeply loyal to the temple, to its stability, to its authority, to its survival. And that loyalty, that institutional self-preservation instinct is exactly what made them willing to execute an innocent man to protect the system. Real loyalty to what the temple was supposed to be, a house of prayer for all nations, a place where the excluded could encounter the living God. Real loyalty to that would have looked like siding with Jesus. And that distinction between loyalty to the institution and loyalty to what the institution claims to stand for, that's one of the most important things you can learn to hold clearly. Because institutions will always ask you to conflate those two things. They will always frame loyalty to their survival as loyalty to the mission. And sometimes those are the same thing. And sometimes one of them requires betraying the other. Let's flip this framework for a minute, right? Because we've been talking about Judas and what it looks like to make that deal, that backroom in the dark alley deal. But Holy Week is also full of people who didn't make that deal. The woman who anoints Jesus with expensive perfume just before Judas goes to the chief priests, which some of the Gospels tells us is Mary of Bethany, and others just leave her as someone else. The disciples who leave everything again to follow Jesus into Jerusalem, even when it's clear things are escalating. Mary, who still will stand at the foot of the cross when almost everyone else has scattered. These people aren't celebrated because they were strategically smart. They're not celebrated because they figured out how to stay at the table and work within the system. They're remembered because they chose loyalty to the person and the vision over their own safety and comfort and survival, and it cost them. That's the thing that empire and capitalism and every system built on self-preservation doesn't want you to believe. That there is something worth being loyal to that's more important than your safety. that the price of not selling out is sometimes very high. And paying that price is not stupidity or naivety. It's the most human and most holy thing you can do. Now, I'm not romanticizing suffering here. I want to be clear about that. There's a version of this teaching that has been used to marginalize people in harmful situations, where people say, stay and endure, your suffering is holy. That's not what I'm saying. There's a difference between suffering that comes from choosing loyalty to love and justice when that choice costs you something, and suffering that comes from being trapped in a system that is harming you, and you're being told harm is sacred. The first is what the disciples experience. The second is what empire inflicts. And part of what we're trying to do, Missiongathering, right? Part of what following Jesus honestly requires is learning to tell the difference between those two things. To know when staying is faithfulness and when staying is just fear dressed up as a virtue. To know when the institution deserves your loyalty and when it has forfeited your loyalty. To know when 30 pieces of silver is being offered, and to be the kind of person who can say, no, not for that price, not for any price. Judas goes out into the night, and the text says he looked for an opportunity. That phrase has stayed with me because the deal is made, but it still requires an act. It still requires him to follow through. And think about all those moments between Wednesday and Thursday night when he could have gone back. He could have said, I've made a mistake. I'm not going to do this. The deal isn't irreversible until he makes it irreversible. I think that's true for most of the small betrayals we make too, isn't it? The compromise isn't permanent until we make it permanent. The silence isn't a permanent choice until we decide to keep being silent. The institution doesn't have our full loyalty until we give it our full loyalty. Most of us are somewhere between Wednesday and Thursday night right now. We've made some accommodations we're not proud of. We've been quiet when we should have spoken. We protected ourselves when we should have protected someone else. We've let the system recruit our compliance in ways we didn't fully notice until later. And the question Spy Wednesday is asking is not, are you Judas? The question is, what are you going to do next? Because the story isn't over. There's still Thursday, still Friday, still Saturday, still Sunday. And you still get to decide what kind of person you're going to be for the days that are coming. That's the invitation here, not guilt, not shame, not a clean conscience you don't deserve. Just a question, what's next? The community, this community, we're trying to answer that question together. Honestly, out loud, without pretending it's an easy answer. So come join us as we try to answer that together. Or try to answer that question in whatever community you belong to right now. I hope that this has been more interesting than a story about cartoon villains twisting their mustaches. Seeing how all of us have some of this living inside us. Thanks for being here for today's episode. Tomorrow is Maundy Thursday, the Last Supper, the foot washing, the garden, the arrest. It's the night everything breaks open, and it starts with Jesus doing the most unexpectedly intimate thing in the entire gospel story. So that's the next episode. If this series has been landing with you, if it's been something that you've really felt like others need to hear, share it. Leave a review. Tell someone. If today's episode stirred something uncomfortable, sit with it. Don't rush to resolve it. Actually, you know what? In the comments, just put up a praying hand sign or put the word prayer, and I'll pray for you as you sit with this. The discomfort is probably doing something useful within you. Discomfort is how we grow. Thank you so much, everyone. Mission Gathering is online and in person. Links in the show notes, and we'll see you next time.